This is the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lay Miller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. What do young adults today want from sex and relationships? And how is this different compared to generations past? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. We're going to dive into the State of Dating Report, a collaborative scientific analysis put together by the Kinsey Institute and Field, the dating app for the curious. This report contains data from Field members, as well as the results from a number of national surveys, and it provides a snapshot of what sex and dating look like right now. Some of the things we're going to explore include why younger adults are having less sex overall, but more kinky sex, how preferences for different types of relationships vary across generations, as well as reasons behind the rise of LGBTQ identities in Generation Z. I am joined by Dr. Nicole McNichols, an associate teaching professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Washington. Nicole's course, The Diversity of Human Sexuality, is the largest and most popular course in the university's history, with 4,000 enrolled students each year. Nicole is the co-author of the textbook, Human Sexuality in a Diverse Society, and author of the forthcoming book, You Could Be Having Better Sex. This is going to be another fun and informative conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Are you curious about sex and psychology in other countries? Join me and Sexual Health Alliance as we expand your knowledge through their study abroad programs. Let's explore different cultures, engage in immersive learning experiences, and collaborate with international experts while traveling to amazing places and having fun with students from all around the world. Since 2015, Sexual Health Alliance has remained at the forefront of sexuality education. So join me, Shah, and a global community of students for a transformative study abroad adventure. There are 4 study abroad options throughout 2025. Check them out at sexualhealthalliance.com. Come meet fantastic people and be at the leading edge of sexual health education with Sexual Health Alliance. Spots for 2025 are available now, so visit sexualhealthalliance.com to secure yours today and embark on an exciting global adventure to study sex and psychology with me. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting sex science. Hi, Nicole, and welcome back to the Sex and Psychology Podcast.
Thank you, Justin. I'm so excited to be back.
Well, I'm so glad to have you join me once again. So we're going to be talking all about a report that was released last month by the Kinsey Institute and the dating app Field that looked at the state of sex and dating today. Now, I helped to co-write that report, so we're going to do something a little different in this episode and allow Nicole to ask me some questions about it. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, first of all, this is a lot of fun for me, Justin, because I always get to hear your amazing insights. And so this is your turn to be on the hot seat. So it'll be a fun experience. Okay, so let's start from the very beginning. Just tell us about what the goal of this report was and what kind of data were you relying on as you were putting it together?
So the goal was really to understand what's going on in people's sex and dating lives today, and also to look at how the trends might be different for people of different generations. So how are things similar or different for people in Gen Z versus millennials, Gen X, and boomers? So that was really kind of the goal here. And we relied on multiple data sources. So as part of this project, we collected data from Field members. So specifically, Field commissioned a survey of more than 3,000 members of the app to look at their sexual attitudes, dating experiences, and so forth. And then in addition to that, we looked at data from a variety of Kinsey Institute studies that have been published over the years that can add further insight into what the landscape of sex and dating looks like today. So we have data that comes from multiple sources here, and they're all saying roughly pretty similar things, which I think can give us some pretty good confidence that what we're seeing here are pretty definitive trends.
What really struck me is just how much the results that you have in this report totally mirror the data that I find when I polled my own students on these very questions. For example, the somewhat sad fact that they are having a lot less sex than we might otherwise think, and especially compared to, say, millennials or Gen X was 20 years ago or 30 years ago when we were all in college. And so I'm wondering if you can just speak about that finding a little bit more and tell us if you have any other insights.
Yeah, so this is something that we've been seeing in the data for many years now, that it seems like each cohort of younger adults is having less sex than the cohort that came before them. And it's not just that young adults are having less sex. Like across the board, you look at people of all ages and all types of relationship statuses across different cultures, like everybody is having somewhat less sex than they used to be having on average. But we see that the effect is particularly pronounced for the youngest adults. So Gen Z is having significantly fewer sexual partners and engaging in sex with a significantly lower frequency than any previous generation. They also seem to be delaying sexual activity longer. So they're starting to become sexually active later compared to generations past. And I think this is one of those $1 million questions. Like everybody wants to know, why is that? Why are they having less sex? And everybody likes to point to technology as the culprit, right? So we're spending all of our time on our phones, on our computers, with Netflix, watching online porn. We're just so distracted by technology that we can't form human connections anymore. And I think, there's some truth to that, but I think it's an oversimplification. Like it's not just about this greater access to technology and the way technology pervades our everyday life. I think something else we have to look at is that Gen Z is really the most stressed and anxious generation. I see this in my own data and in lots of other data sources. Like stress and anxiety levels are through the roof. And we know that those are things that can really significantly lower libido and make you less interested or less desirous of sex. We also know that this generation has a higher percentage of being treated by antidepressants and other psychotropic medications, which we know have a lot of sexual side effects that accompany them. And so that might be playing a role here as well. And then when you couple in the fact that Gen Z isn't just having less sex, but they're also binge drinking less, they're using less drugs, they're doing less of the partying that, previous generations did. And I think a lot of those other things kind of worked in tandem with sex because a lot of people use substances as a way of reducing inhibitions and getting in the mood. And so when you're sort of taking that out of the mix, that is also going to co-vary to some extent with sex. So I think there's a lot of different things that are going on here.
Absolutely. And with that last point, I've always wondered if maybe there's almost a positive spin or explanation for this. I mean, could it be that people are, especially from my understanding of the data, undergraduate women are drinking a lot less. And so if there's fewer of those circumstances where people are having sex that maybe they wouldn't have consented to beforehand, then maybe it's just that people are being more selective about their sexual experiences, which ultimately might be positive. The other thing that I feel like is really interesting is when you look at data that shows just how much later the average age of marriage is, right? I mean, I think that kids are now getting, or I should say young adults are now getting married. I think the average age is about 30 or 29 for women and 30 for men. And just from a practical standpoint, you're probably going to be having sex with higher amounts of frequency if you're in a relationship versus if you're not. And so again, not to be Pollyannish about all this, but if it's that people are thinking, okay, maybe my number one goal isn't to just get out of college and get married, but I want to focus on my career and I have other interests and I have other passions, then if your sexual frequency is going down by a little bit, but these other areas of your life are being prioritized, maybe that's not the huge emergency that a lot of us are hoping it's not. So.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point. And, it gets to the bigger question of, all right, young adults are having less sex. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? And, personally, I'm agnostic on it, because, we need to know what the reasons are and then also look at, well, are they satisfied with having less sex, right? So the question of satisfaction is different from the question of, are they having sex at all or how much sex are they having? And are they having more of the sex that they actually want to have, right? So those are some of the key questions to consider here. And also, there is this delayed adulthood phenomenon that's happening, right? So when you look at young adults today, like they're not necessarily following the same trajectory of benchmarks of adulthood, like when they get their driver's license and when they move out of their parents' home and when they get their first job and get married, like all of these things are being pushed back further and further. And so when they're waiting longer to enter and develop committed relationships, I think that's necessarily going to have implications for what their sex lives look like, because historically in the data, we've always seen that people in relationships are having more sex than singles. There's always been this stereotype that singles are getting it on all the time and having wild and crazy sex lives, like it looks like Sex in the City or something like that. But in reality, now singles are actually just not doing it as much because they don't have as many opportunities for sex if you don't have a regular sexual partner.
Yeah. And, this makes me remember I was just going through your social media, and I think you just did a post about how more and more adults are claiming celibacy, right? They're taking sort of oaths, or not oaths, but they're just choosing, that's a different story, but they're choosing to be celibate, right? And that's a good thing in that people are taking ownership for their own sexual choices. But I also wonder just how you see that feeding into this data and if that's sort of consistent with what your takeaways were.
Yeah, the decision not to have sex, I think, is just as empowering as the decision to have sex, right? When you're choosing what you do with your own body and how you want to engage sexually on your own terms, like whether you're having sex or not having sex, it's a good thing if you feel empowered to make the decisions that are right for you. And we do see in the data that younger adults are increasingly likely to identify as celibate or to take periods of celibacy in their lives. And there are lots of different reasons for that. Sometimes it's about just wanting to avoid certain risks that come along with sexual activity. And when you talk about risks related to sex, that can be related to concerns about sexual assault or violence. It can be related to concerns about unintended or unwanted pregnancy. It can be related to sexually transmitted infections, right? So some people are doing it for risk avoidance. Others are doing it because they just want to focus on themselves right now and focus on personal growth and development. And for some, it's also just about reclaiming your independence and autonomy. And celibacy is one of those things that can be tricky and tough and challenging for some people, but it can also be very rewarding for others. So yeah, this trend toward voluntary celibacy is certainly part of the story here in terms of why young adults are having less sex. In fact, some of them are specifically choosing not to be sexually active.
Yeah, which is great. The other thing that really drew my interest here was, I have this finding in my class where not only are students having a lot less sex, but at the same time, and this is a little bit of a paradox, they're reporting higher and higher levels, I find, each quarter of wanting to be in a monogamous relationship and wanting to find that one true love. So my heart kind of goes out to them every quarter as they're experiencing all these frustrations, and definitely, are prioritizing careers and their passions and, don't see marriage necessarily as something that needs to happen right away, but do view it as a long-term goal. They seem to have sort of a lot of ambivalence around it. And I was just wondering how you saw that in terms of the data in the study.
Yeah, so in the survey of Field members, and you have to recognize that Field is a dating app for the curious. And so, it tends to draw members who maybe are a little bit more sexually open to begin with. But what was really interesting was that in that survey of Field members, when you looked at Gen Z specifically, their single most preferred relationship style was monogamy, right? And you might think that on a dating app for the curious, maybe that wouldn't be the case, especially for younger adults, where in the popular media, they're often kind of stereotyped or seen as this generation of polyamory that's breaking all the norms and they're doing relationships on their own terms. But, while it is certainly true that many young adults are open to deviating from monogamy and trying new and different relationship structures, we're also seeing this large subgroup of young adults who are very drawn to monogamy. And I see that in my own sexual fantasy data, where younger adults are fantasizing about monogamy at much higher rates than older adults. And older adults have more fantasies about open relationships than younger adults, right? So it doesn't necessarily align with the conventional wisdom that people might have about relationships and what people want from them. And I think for young adults, for Gen Z, I think there's kind of this romanticization of monogamy. in part because online dating, it's the only kind of dating that a lot of young adults have ever known. And we know that it can be kind of a toxic cesspool at times, right? Where you get unsolicited dick pics, you have ambiguous messages, you have people who ghost you. There can be a lot of toxic behavior that occurs in online spaces that I think can turn a lot of them off to dating and can actually make it harder to find the kinds of relationships that they want. But in terms of why they might want monogamy more, like I said, there's this romanticization because online dating just makes it more challenging and complex and difficult in some ways. On the one hand, it introduces us to so many more people than we could otherwise meet in person. But then there's that paradox of choice, like so many options and opportunities, but also, all of this toxic behavior as well. And I think when you contrast that with how things used to be, right, with traditional courtship practices, like things used to be a lot clearer because people had to state their intentions, right? And they had to court you and display their interest in you with very overt and romantic gestures. And, I can't help but think about shows like Bridgerton when I talk about this, where, you've got this romanticized ideal of love and it's so clear, right? The other person's intention, and it all seems so romantic and easy and so forth in a lot of ways. And so I think, that's part of the appeal here is that when you contrast modern online dating with traditional courtship, maybe one seems a little bit better than the other. We always kind of want what we can't have, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think so much of those issues with online dating also just come from total misalignment of motivations, right? I'm thinking of a study I read last year about how if you actually break down and ask people what they're looking for on the dating apps, the majority of them say they're looking for, either casual sex or a relationship, but a lot of them are on there just to seek validation. And when I interview or when I poll my own students, a lot of them say, I'm just kind of looking to see if I can get some attention or if I'm bored or it's just a game to me. And so you can imagine that if you have a huge chunk of people who are looking to try to achieve genuine connection on a dating app and you're getting matched with people for whom it's just a game, that leads to some very frustrating experiences, especially when you consider that back yonder when I was in college and, when I met my husband, we didn't even have dating apps, let alone the iPhone. You met people typically through friends, or there were usually at least some other common people that you knew. And that kind of held you accountable a little bit, right? I mean, you weren't going to do something absolutely awful to another person if you kind of knew that there was a chance that the person who had introduced you would know about it and maybe think a little bit less of you because of that behavior. So I think the anonymity of it also is hard. But at the same time, I do feel like what we're really lacking is, there's been so many conversations around porn literacy. I feel like we need dating app literacy. I mean, I do think that there are ways to use dating apps where you minimize the chance of interactions like that, which could probably be its own separate podcast episode. But I don't think, the reality is that over 50% of couples are reporting that they met on dating apps. I mean, they do have some success. I was just at a dinner with a friend last night. She's a lawyer. She's been working nonstop, but she has 3 Bumble dates that she arranged for next week, which was with people she would have never just met normally in her own world. So I do think there are positives there. I just think we need to kind of teach people best practices so that we're not all getting ghosted and having these sort of miserable experiences. But back to something you were saying before, I find it really funny because similar to the field data, the students that I teach really kind of line up with everything you're describing. I mean, they're definitely the kinds of people who you would probably expect on field. A lot of them report being kinky. A lot of them have queer identities. A lot of them are, open, very into exploring their sexuality. I mean, obviously they're choosing to take a human sexuality class. So they're coming in with a certain level of sex positivity to begin with. But boy, you start talking about long-term relationships and marriage, and they just turn into a bunch of saps. I mean, the idealism that comes with their ideas of what long-term relationships and marriage are going to look like just seem to totally contradict kind of these more, maybe less conservative, slightly edgier, if you will, ideas about what great sex looks like. And I'm thinking of a conversation that I even just had just last week where, we were talking about, and I think I actually heard you interviewing somebody about this very question on your podcast. And I started asking my students the same thing because I wanted to see if it sort of lined up with what you found, which was, let's say that you were in a long-term relationship and that your partner cheated on you, right? And let's say that it was going to be a one-time thing. Let's say it happened while they were traveling. You would never know about it and they were not going to do it again. Would you want to know about it? And they all look at me like, of course, yes. Like it's going to be this hugely diagnostic piece of information that's going to completely change my decision about my relationship. But you kind of start to ask more middle-aged people or people who have been in monogamous relationships for a longer period of time. And I don't think you get the same level of consensus on the answer to that question. There tends to be a bit more realism about what it's like to be married to the same person for 20, 30 years. And maybe there can just be an experience that you just would rather not know about, just kind of like there are other things that we don't necessarily want to think about with our partners that maybe are less of a big deal than just depending on what your own particular perspective is. But my point is just I find it endearing, but also just really interesting, the paradox between their openness around sex, but their conservative ideas around relationships.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a generational difference there. And, part of it might be due to differences in experience. If you haven't had much relationship experience, you might have different standards or expectations for what your relationship should be. But I think that younger adults do have higher expectations or standards for their relationships and what they want out of them. And I think this is tied in with social media, where we tend to see these depictions of, this is what a good relationship should be. This is healthy behavior. This is unhealthy behavior. Everything is very clear cut and black and white. And, if there's one problem, the relationship just isn't going to work, right? So I think part of it has to do with that, which is just that we're learning about, sort of different ideas for relationships, and social media has become the way that we learn about them. And there's a lot on there that just says, if your partner ever does this, get rid of them because they're a bad person. And I think that's certainly part of the story here.
And you see that dating advice all over the internet and all over social media that, if they're not obsessed with you, get rid of them immediately, right? When the reality is relationships just don't work that way, at least healthy love, right? To your point, I think people are often just posting, of course, what they want others to see on their social media. And so there's a lot of comparison among younger people looking to that as this is the ideal. And if anything, my relationship doesn't match that ideal, there must be a problem. But I think this kind of leads into another really interesting finding from your study, which is that interest in non-monogamy tends to be higher among middle-aged adults as opposed to young adults. And am I right that that's what you found?
Yeah, actually, I see that in my fantasy data, where when you look at people at different decades of life, you actually see what we call a curvilinear relationship when it comes to non-monogamy fantasies, where they're lowest among young adults and then they increase through your 30s, peak in the 40s and 50s, and then start to decline somewhat after that. But they never come back down to the level that they were for the youngest adults. So, overall interest in non-monogamy rises, but it peaks for those midlife adults.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember you presented that data at Quad S last year, and I think I asked you if you had any ideas why. And I remember your answer was, realistic ideas about long-term relationships, but also that people in middle age just kind of give fewer fucks about what other people think of them. So choosing an alternative relationship structure doesn't seem maybe quite as scary.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And then also just, the Coolidge effect, right? So we know that people kind of become habituated to the same sexual stimulus over time, and that we need novelty to reawaken sexual excitement. And for most people who are at midlife, they've been involved in long-term monogamous relationships for some period of time and might just be craving something new and different. And so I think that's part of what the drive for non-monogamy might be at that particular life stage, is just the wanting, the yearning for something that's just new and different sexually.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, along that line, do you see other differences in sexual fantasies between people who are younger and older?
One of the other big ones I see is that for young adults, in addition to having kinkier fantasies, they also have more romantic and passion and romance kind of fantasies, right? So it's exactly like what you were just talking about, where they've got these romantic ideas of relationships, but they also want to do it in a really kinky way at the same time. And I think these things are tied together. Like, I think for a lot of young adults, what they're really wanting is validation, acceptance, to feel desired and wanted and so forth. And so I think that's part of where the passion and romance fantasies come in. But going back to what I was saying earlier about young adults also being the most stressed and anxious generation, I think part of the reason they're drawn to kink is because kink is a handy way of changing your headspace, right? And temporarily shedding your anxieties and insecurities so that you can really be in the moment. So yeah, it's kink and passion are what young adults fantasize about. If you look at midlife adults, you're seeing a lot more novelty related fantasies, not just in terms of multiple partners, but like mixing it up and trying new and different and exciting and adventurous things like having public sex and so forth.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think your point about how kink can bring you into the moment, and that might be, especially when we're looking at a generation that is so much more at risk for anxiety and depression, and any experience that can make you more present is probably one that's very valued. Just to shift gears slightly, I also thought it was fascinating that in your data you found this fact that more and more younger generations are identifying as LGBTQ or identifying as genderqueer. And I'm just curious, I know that that's, we see that, and especially when I pull my own class, I think that the nationally representative data is showing us that 22% of Gen Z identifies as under the LGBTQ spectrum, and that I think 80% of them are identifying as bisexual. And I'm just wondering, on the one hand, sure, this is a field study, and so we're going to have more sex positive, diverse samples to begin with, but still, given that this is, being confirmed by other nationally representative data that we see, I thought that part was really interesting.
Yeah, so a majority of the field members who are young adults identified as LGBTQ in some way. And when you look at the national surveys, representative data, for that age group, it's between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 who are identifying as LGBTQ. And as you noted, the vast majority of them are identifying as bisexual. It's interesting when you look at trends over time, you haven't seen much movement in terms of the number of people who identify as gay or lesbian. Where you're seeing all the growth is in identification as bisexual, pansexual, queer, or other sexual identities. You're also seeing growth in non-binary and transgender identities, especially among young adults, also people who identify as fluid. And that's one of the other things that we saw in the field data is that, when you look at members of the app over time, I forget the number off the top of my head, but a significant proportion of young adults report that they changed their gender or sexual identity since using the app. And we asked people who had experienced one of those changes why that was the case. And the single most common reason they reported was that they had developed a deeper sense or understanding of their own gender or sexual identity, right? So in the process of dating and interacting with other people, we might learn new things about ourselves, and that might change the way that we identify. And I think, this idea is, I guess I would say, threatening to some people in the sense that it might sound like it's undermining the born this way argument. But the reality is that identity is a fluid thing, and it can change over the course of our lives as we come to better understand ourselves, And I don't think people's underlying predispositions toward a certain gender or toward a certain sexual orientation. It's not that these things are changing. It's just the terminology that we use to label ourselves and present ourselves to the outside world. That is what is changing or evolving. And we're seeing that younger adults have greater openness to shifting how they identify based on how they understand themselves at this moment in time, and recognizing that, hey, that might not be totally stable or static over the course of my life. And that's okay, because I'm constantly changing my understanding of myself.
Yeah, no, I think that's really beautiful. And, I'm always struck because I get a lot of parents who ask me about this, hey, it seems like there's more people more kids who are identifying as gay, lesbian, or bisexual or as trans than there were 20, 30 years ago. And is it a fad? And it's interesting because that question is really framed as something where it's a negative thing, right? Like, why is everyone identifying this way? And what's interesting and that needs to be pointed out is that people come to their identities in such different ways. It's so nuanced. Some people realize that they're trans when they're 2 or 3 years old. Other people will realize, that they have a different sexual identity when they're, going through puberty. And it just makes sense that if you think about adolescence, it's such a natural time to be exploring so many different aspects of who you are and what your identity is. And so wouldn't it make sense that your sexuality would also be one of those dimensions? We're so used to living in this heteronormative society where we assume that everybody is straight until proven otherwise. And maybe it's natural to think about these other identities or things that might feel right to you, just the same way that you would feel about, do I like math? Am I into science? Do I like basketball? I don't think that there's a problem with deciding that you want to try on a different sexual identity if it feels right to you in the moment, and then being okay with changing your mind later on, right? And I think that that's important for people to understand that change and fluidity is healthy and actually much more consistent with virtually every other aspect of our identity and of ourselves, that it's more natural, I think, to have that flexibility, not something that we should all be alarmed by.
Right. And I think, for young adults today, they also just have more options for how to identify themselves in terms of their gender or sexuality. A lot of the terms that exist today did not exist when I was a teenager growing up in the 1990s, right? The term non-binary didn't exist. You only had gay, lesbian, or bisexual in terms of sexual identity labels, but people didn't even believe bisexuality was a thing, right? So it was just heterosexual or gay, or if you're bi, you're just secretly gay, right? And, the term cisgender wasn't a thing that, people understood as a term. So, the terminology, the language, all of these things have evolved over time. And, it also makes sense that as our understanding evolves, as you have more opportunities to identify and label yourselves in ways that make sense to you, that you're going to see more diversity and variability in terms of how people identify.
And I talk about that with my students. And I think another prime example is if you look at something like asexuality, right? If, a person who's demisexual is somebody who might only experience feelings of sexual attraction if they're already in a committed, stable relationship. Well, that describes the experiences of a lot of people, right? So it's not that we would label them as asexual 30 years ago, but now all of these different experiences have been normalized, can be celebrated. And to your point, we just have the language and the ideas and the science to show that it's great to be able to identify in these different ways. And they are accurate representations of your experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for chatting with me about the latest field report. For people who want to learn more about it, they can visit my website, sexandpsychology.com, or they can go to Field's website. I will include links to the report in the show notes.
Thanks, Justin.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Nicole. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Thanks so much, Justin. I loved being here. And yes, please, you can follow my work either by following me on social media, Instagram or TikTok, Nicole_the Sex Professor. You can also follow a lot of my work if you sign up for my newsletter by going to my website, www.nicolethesexprofessor.com.
And I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on Twitter and TikTok at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future episode of this show, you can leave me a podcast voicemail at speakpipe.com/sexandpsychology. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.